Good afternoon and welcome to the ABC7 studios. If you were having a dinner party in California and you had about 5 to 10 people that you really wanted that are interesting to come to that party and sit around and have great conversation, I got to think Dr. Lucy Jones would be one of those people, especially here in California. Dr. Jones, thank you so much for joining us. I've got to tell you, we have so many questions from viewers that I'm sure every time you go anywhere, people are stopping you and asking, but I want to say thanks first off for joining us.
Sure, I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, Dr. Jones, you were at Caltech for so long. Do you still miss it? Do you miss being over there? Do you miss your colleagues? I know you've gone off to different things.
Well, okay, so my employment for many years was actually with the U.S. Geological Survey, and my appointment at Caltech was honorary because we had a USGS office on campus. And when I retired from the USGS, Caltech actually offered to continue the appointment and gave me an office actually at the Caltech side of the operation. So I've been able to continue to see people up until, of course, the pandemic when we stopped being able to do in person.
Well, I love the fact that now I know. So for the longest time, you were the USGS, but every time there was an earthquake, we went to Caltech and you were right there front and center. And recently we've had swarms and we've had a lot of, we've learned a lot of statistical information from Caltech, from USGS. Can we talk about swarms and what is a swarm? What does it mean?
Yes, of course. A swarm just means you've got a group of earthquakes that are happening at the same time. And that you don't have one that's a lot larger than the other, rather that you have several that are all, the largest are all sort of clustered together. And it's just in the range of what we have with earthquakes. Every earthquake makes another earthquake more likely. And often they're distributed like a main shock, aftershock, but sometimes in a group. So being a swarm in and of itself doesn't give us more concern about having a big earthquake. It's rather the fact of where they were happening.
Well, now that leads to one of our questions that we got from a viewer, and you almost answered it right there. So after this is from Lexi Bryant. After the swarm of earthquakes near the Salton Sea, what's the % chance of a major quake?
Okay, so back on Monday, over a week ago when they happened, USGS issued a statement. It was actually based on part of work that I'd done left the USGS that said a 1% chance of a big San Andreas earthquake in the next week. And by comparison, instead of 1 in 100, like this week, it's more like 1 in 10,000. And because of that one earthquake, it increased the risk. But it dies off very rapidly with time, really with the first days. And once you get past that time, there's very little.
Well, that's kind of a wonderful thing to hear, because I was kind of curious how the public should take the information when there's a swarm or a smaller earthquake, because we know a quake, we know an aftershock, we know the foreshock, but when, just to kind of give us that, I love the fact that the percentages drop off so quickly, but what should the public do when they get information, they hear, oh, there's a swarm?
Okay, the swarm doesn't make it any difference than any other earthquake. What you should be listening for is, where is the event? If we have a swarm in Los Angeles, people will probably be very upset because they'll be feeling multiple earthquakes. But it really doesn't increase the risk very much. In fact, I can remember, this is quite a while ago, we had a swarm going on in Ontario, and the largest one was only about a magnitude 2.5. It really didn't change the risk of a big earthquake much at all. But they were very shallow, and there were people that were feeling tens of them per day and completely flipping out. But that part isn't what makes it dangerous. When we worry about setting off a big earthquake, we need to be near the fault that would produce the big earthquake. The only way you get a big earthquake is having a long fault. So when we're right by the San Andreas, we have a greater chance that an earthquake that happens there could trigger an 8 because you've got fault capable of the 8. If you're in a place that doesn't have any big fault around, then your chance of setting off a really big
You know, you bring up something that just came to me right now. Every time, and we talk about Ontario and a string of earthquakes that were a swarm, the one thing that always jumps to me is what's happening. Is this the beginning of something? How close am I to the epicenter? All of these things keep jumping through my mind. I'm curious. You are an expert. You're Dr. Lucy Jones. You have all of the answers for us. What's it like for you as a human being? Do you switch into science mode, or do you actually think like the rest of us and go, what am I feeling? What part of this am I feeling? Where am I?
I think I use the science mode to cope with the feelings, if
Okay.
you will, because we all have, I'm human. I would be scared in a really big earthquake. But by being a scientist as well, I'm also curious. And so when I feel an earthquake, one of the things I do is start counting right away, because if I can feel both the P and the S wave and recognize the time between them, I can estimate how far away that earthquake is. Now, of course, we're getting that information out within, seconds at this point, instead of, needing to go into the lab and do the work to figure it out. But also trying to estimate how big it is. And I do remember, a fundamental part of my research early on was recognizing the rate at which foreshocks happen. So when you hear that there's 5% chance that an earthquake will trigger a bigger one, that was work that I did back in the 80s, just going through and counting earthquakes. Mm-hmm. So I know whenever I feel an earthquake, I got a 5% chance that there will be an even bigger one within the next day or two. And
And it what? What was the last part?
I'm sorry. You have another show broadcasting into my ear that's as loud as you are, and I am being pretty challenged to.
Well, I'm hopeful. We'll say it right here online that our guy Jay back in the at the assignment desk, maybe he can figure out a way to turn that off so that you aren't having to deal with that, because we're just getting started. So hopefully it will get fixed. But if we can, we'll switch gears a little bit. We'll come back to the earthquakes. But I want to talk about pandemic, because I know that you want to talk about the pandemic as well. You are a disaster scientist. It's not just earthquakes, but disasters in general. Have you prepared to deal with the pandemic? What do you think about with that?
Well, okay, so I hadn't had extra preparation. It wasn't something that was very high on my radar. And in fact, I was in New Zealand when this started to break out and had to come home through LAX worrying about what it would set off. But one thing I do have is I have the ability to read scientific articles and figure out what they're trying to say. And experience in the process of how to get science heard and listened to by the general public, by decision makers. And epidemiology is a well-developed science. They know how this is happening. They understood how we should be thinking about it, and we didn't listen. And so at first, I was really sort of spending the time trying to understand the science, listening to what the recommendations were, staying home. I am old enough that I'm considered in an at-risk demographic. And I don't want to get this. I've tried very hard to do all the things that make sense. And as I read it, we've all seen it now. I guess I was watching it develop as the science started really coming through, that what matters is sharing air, that it's breathing in what's breathed out by a sick person. So I spent some time with this, really trying to, do the science communication aspect. If you look at this, let's see, out of thousands of cases, we can find 2 that happened, transmission outside. All of the others are pretty clearly transmission inside. Seems like being outside is a safer place to be. And I made a recommendation to a church that was asking me, why didn't you just hold your services outside? And of course, that's now where the recommendations have come. I think one of the really important things to see here is that, science isn't an answer. It's a process for determining what's true. And science communication, we have found, is much more effective when it's very consistent messaging and you hear the same thing from multiple sources. In a pandemic, we didn't have the science done, right? We can say, well, this is what respiratory illnesses are like, but this one is novel. It's new. We don't know how this one behaves. So we got the recommendations that were there for the generic respiratory disease. As it's gone on, they're recognizing that sharing air is a much bigger issue than touching surfaces. And the recommendations have shifted. You still want to wash your hands, but it's not the most important. They're really trying to focus on wearing masks inside, right? That's our sort of the one really big thing we could do now. And so the message shifted, and the social science tells us that's a bad thing to do. Physical reality is you've got to do it when you don't have all the information at the beginning. But now we do. And we really do need to work at emphasizing the message that we now know to be true, and really doing what we can, because people are dying because we aren't listening to science. And you're asking how I'm feeling about it. I've gotten to the point of being angry. We could have held on a bit longer. We opened up too soon. We had the scientists clearly tell us the criteria for reopening, and we didn't wait for it. And people have died because of that. And that's, I've spent my life trying to get science used to try and bridge that gap between the researchers and the policymakers. And this is very frustrating.
That leads me to one question, the research and the policymakers, because there was an article not too long ago, George W. Bush had a pandemic task force, but then it couldn't get funding because it hadn't happened yet. Is that a frustration for you as a scientist when you come forward with an idea that says, hey, we need to be ready for something like this, but it's not on the front burner for the policymakers at that moment?
Well, that's always going to be the case, and we see it. It's like when we come up with ideas of ways to make the earthquake system better, we wait for we sort of get it all ready so that we're ready when the earthquake happens, and people want to listen to this. That's sort of a standard part of disaster science. So at some point, you learn to accept that. But this situation is goes beyond not getting the greatest idea. It really has been, let's just try to pretend, or let's imagine, let's use, power of positive thinking. We're going to say this doesn't matter. And, reality doesn't care if you believe in it or not. And the consequences are just so large, and I guess the other part is that what the science shows us when you're dealing with a pandemic, this isn't individual decisions. This is really, you have to do things for the good of the larger community. And wearing masks is not a personal decision about keeping yourself safe. It's about keeping everyone around you safe and interfering with the progression of the pandemic. And, there have been studies now that are suggesting if we could get 80% of actual mask wearing, if we had a universal mask mandate, and we got 80% compliance, we could get rid of the pandemic. And that isn't just something nice, that's people's lives. And don't other people's lives matter enough to you to do it? And this is a particularly American problem. We are so individualistic. We have a hard time talking about common good. Whenever we talk about earthquake preparedness, people always want to ask me, what do I do as an individual? And I'm like, how about working together as a community to get better building codes? Well, no, what can I do? And I think that we're now seeing horribly clearly the consequences of that. And, the earthquake, of course, it takes longer. It's not quite so clear how your decisions play out with the death in the next earthquake. Now it's painfully obvious because we now have case studies between different countries about how they've handled it and how they've responded. And we can see that by giving up before the epidemiologist said we should, we've gone back into, high transmission. Hopefully we seem to be getting it back down again in California. We can't make the same mistake.
Well, the pandemic leads to a couple of questions from viewers. So let's show you one from, this is from Libel well, I don't even know their username. Will we have enough resources to help our communities while we're still in this pandemic? What do you think about that?
I think we do. I mean, when you look at resource issues, we finally figured out the supply chain quirks that of everything that changed when we went into a different mode. And we haven't interfered horribly with production. You know, the real economic disruption is personal services and hospitality that have really suffered. And those are not core necessities that you need to respond to a disaster. I would say the thing I most worry about if we, had a big earthquake right now, if one of the wildfires really gets out of control, whatever our disaster is the social disruption. And how do we work together? Because, the way you recover from a disaster is really mobilizing the community and people working together. And we're struggling at that right now.
Another question, and it's kind of interesting because you brought up earthquakes with the pandemic. How has the pandemic showed our weak areas in earthquake preparedness?
I think some ways they've showed some good things, right? But also the only things the pandemic can show about earthquake preparedness are the social side of things. And, early on, I'd say, and this is common with a lot of disasters, at the beginning, helping others is a lot easier to do. As it drags on, as you lose your job, as things get more disrupted, then we tend to be less charitable. And we start seeing anger and blame because it's a lot easier to be angry than fearful. Fear is a really hard emotion to live with. And we move into this. And I think that those social weaknesses that we always knew were there, we're seeing to some extent. I would say it's probably better than I was afraid it might be. I'm actually been pretty impressed, at least within California, of how we've been able to mostly help each other. The part, of course, if you ask me, what's the important part of earthquake preparedness, it's not about having supplies supplies and communication plans are important. I'd rather prevent the damage in the first place. I want building codes. I want stronger water pipes. I want it so that we can have the earthquake and not have it disrupt our society. And of course, none of those have been called into question with the pandemic. When you look at the big picture of disasters, there's sort of the shared aspect, which is really the social response. And then there's the mitigation. How do we physically prevent whatever it is turning into a disaster? So it would be developing vaccines for a pandemic and building better buildings for an earthquake and having, your roof tied down more effectively for hurricanes. And so in general, mitigation is disaster specific, whereas the social preparedness is something that gets shared. And just sort of bottom line, I'd say I feel pretty good about where we've shown up on the social side in how we've handled the pandemic, except for our selfishness,
Well, it is interesting. I mean, I think of the Northridge quake and some of the major quakes that we've had here. You can drive 45 minutes away and everything's fine. With a pandemic that is across the world, it's not like you can escape it no matter how much you want to. You have to be prepared as a community, like you're saying.
Oh, and you've really hit the point of what's different about the pandemic. I mean, even the largest earthquake we can imagine isn't even going to get the whole of California. Maybe the Cascadia earthquake will get the whole Pacific Northwest. We still have a lot of the rest of the country that can mobilize and come in and help us. The pandemic disaster is global. And it's not even just the whole United States, it's the whole world being hit with it at the same time, and the whole world going through the economic disruption of the economic systems being stressed by the shutdown. And because of that, scale is a big deal. And I think the consequences of the pandemic are going to be more far-reaching and longer-lasting than what we see for many individual disasters.
I want to talk a little bit about your podcast. It's called Getting Through It.
Thank you.
How exciting is that? I mean, I love being able to have more time to talk with you and talk with other guests that we have here in studio. But having a podcast where you can really get into specifics, what has that been like for you?
It's actually been really fun. You know, it turned out to be not that hard to get me to just talk. What can I say? But it's, you know, to be able to pick a topic, and John and I spend, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes saying, okay, how do we want to structure this discussion? So far, it's been easy to pick topics that I feel comfortable talking about and you know, do 10 or 15 minutes worth of discussion. I've been saying, how are we going to keep this up for a year? And John's like, oh, don't worry, we won't have a problem. So it's great to be able to, you know, it's like doing an interview with you, but I get to say what the questions are. I mean, how good is that?
How hard is it to stay on topic? I've got to think with a podcast, you could potentially go all over the map.
Well, it's one of the reasons we try to keep it down to 10 or 15 minutes per episode. And actually, John ends it every time. We could keep on going, so we'll have to do this again.
Well, one of the things that was not very surprising to us getting ready is that we had so many viewer questions, because a lot of people want to ask questions, and we don't want to go too long and take up too much of your time. So we're going to try to go through some of them very quickly. One of them, your podcast is near and dear to your heart. This one is going to provide me some marital stability. First off, we want to show everybody the Getting Through It podcast. It's a new podcast with Dr. Lucy Jones and John Boiry. Did I pronounce his last name right?
Yeah, got it.
So I know this is probably maybe one of the top questions you get. My wife brought it up the other day. I've heard you 100 times, 1,000 times say it's not possible. A friend of hers in Chicago said the same thing. So here you go. Is there such a thing as earthquake weather? Please solve this for my family.
No, absolutely not. We discussed it in episode 9 on the podcast. So you're right. I've gotten this question a lot. Two ways to look at it. One is just physically, the earthquake's happening, 5 miles below the surface of the earth. You don't have to go very far down, like just into a wine cave, to have complete stability and have the surface weather not make a difference. Number 2 is that every culture in the world has a tradition of earthquake weather, but it's all different types of weather. It's whatever weather that culture had at their most memorable earthquake. And one way to see that our tradition of hot weather being earthquake weather comes because of the 1987 Whittier Narrows earthquake. It was on October 1st. It was well over 100 degrees. And so people got that association, hot weather. But, October 1st is often a hot day. Santa Ana's on October 1st is not unusual in California. And if you went back to my mother's generation, who was a small child in the Long Beach earthquake, she would call really still, foggy, sort of dank weather earthquake weather, because that's what they had on March 10th for the Long Beach earthquake. Not surprising, along the beach in March in Southern California.
Gosh, bless you. I can think of salt mines in Kansas as well, because in Kansas they have salt mines down there. So all you got to do is go below the surface a little bit and the temperature's the same. So thank you. I will be repeating that frequently. Our next question, are we expecting the big one? You talked briefly about this a moment ago, and would we be able to know? That's our number one asked question today, by the way.
Okay. Yes, we will have a big one. It is absolutely inevitable. We are not stopping plate tectonics. The San Andreas fault will eventually slip and give us an earthquake, above 7.5. It happens on average about every 100 to 150 years. In north of LA, it's been about 160 years since the last one. East of LA, it's been about 330 years since the last one. So at some point, our luck will run out. That fault will move. We will have a big earthquake. Now, would we know? No. Right? We know that on average, it's once every 100 years. And we also know that sometimes there's really long intervals. It's already been 330. And if it's already been that, why not 350? Why not 400 years? It could happen. So it's absolutely inevitable, but we don't know when. So it's only inevitable on geologic time. You might not live to see it.
Now, a lot of people have talked about the earthquake warning system. Our next question is, how come the earthquake apps rarely alert us? And I would qualify that by saying, what is an alert? Because I think, in essence, they are working, aren't they?
They are working. It's a fundamental, it's a basic concept that we can record that an earthquake has begun by putting stations, seismic stations, very close to where that earthquake happens. We see the waves coming off it. We now can calculate the approximate location and magnitude of the earthquake within a second. And we send that information to you, which hopefully gets to you before the waves get to you. So if you're literally right on top of the fault, you may get little to no warning. There is an early wave that often people don't feel called the P wave. It's the second wave. It's primary and secondary. The S wave, the second wave, is the larger one that does the damage. So we use that first one to estimate when the second one's going to get to you. The app takes that scientific information being produced by the seismic network and releases it by certain criteria. So originally they set it up. People don't want to know about just little ones. They only want to know about dangerous ones. So we're only going to tell you if it's really strong shaking. I actually had argued against that philosophy, saying people really do want to know, but that was the decision that was made. Obviously, people wanted to know. They changed that criteria. But there still is some criteria, because they aren't going to tell you about little ones that are probably so small that you don't feel them. And then there's some, error in exactly how large the estimate is going to be, for instance. They are working decently well, but they're not going to tell you about a 3. They can't. Because the only place you feel a 3 is when you're right on top of it, and those are the people who don't get it.
And then people would say it doesn't work.
It's only going to work for big ones.
Right. Then they're going to say, oh, it didn't work. I didn't feel that. Now, here's a question for you. How close is the USGS to having an early warning system like that in Japan?
Okay, we have it. This is what we are talking about here, is the same type of early warning system. Now, Japan had it, put it in 2007. We didn't really go operational until the last year or so. It's only applicable really in California at this point. They're trying to get it in Oregon and Washington. The rest of the country is going to have to wait, because Japan invested $600 million to put it in, and we've been getting, USGS gets about $10 million a year to expand on the existing seismic network and add to this. The other thing I'd say is that Japan has it a bit easier, because their biggest earthquakes happen offshore. They are, by definition, almost all far away from where the earthquake's happening, and that makes it easier to get the warning out. As I said, if you're right on top of it, you're really not going to get much of any warning.
So if you could get a warning, it kind of leads us to our next question, where seconds can actually make a difference in what you do. So the question is, safest place to take shelter in an earthquake while inside your apartment or house? Say you get that 5-second warning.
Right. Absolutely, the safest place to be is under a table, because most of our houses don't fall down. Most of our injuries are happening because of objects flying around the room. And they have killed people and a lot of injuries by being hit by flying objects. So getting under a table is a very good thing to do. When we were first working on the earthquake early warning system and trying to understand it, somebody asked us to test how long did it take you from getting a warning to getting under the table. And I would have thought that's a second or two. I could not do it, complete the process in less than 10 seconds. And that's what most people found too. So those few seconds of warning actually could make a really big difference in terms of getting you into a safe location. What you do not want to do is try to run outside. Number one, the outside of the building is often the most dangerous place. And it will, that's where facades fall off of you and whatever. So the last thing you want to be is at the outside of a building, and you have to pass through there to get outside. So it's not good. Also, the process of trying to run when shaking is occurring is the single largest source of injuries that we see. People break their legs, they sprain their ankles because the earthquake is strong enough shaking to throw you to the ground. If it's actually going to damage your building, you're not going to be able to run in it.
Okay, so what are the best preparation practices to keep that what are the best prep practices to keep that won't break the bank during these tough times?
All right. The best one is actually a free one, which is a communication plan. Whoever you care about, what family you have or people that you're living with, work together before the event to talk about how you're going to find each other afterwards. Do a little practicing. Remember that you're not going to be able to call on your cell phone. You can probably get text messages through, probably. Do you have a backup place where you can go to for information? How are you going to reconnect? You can do all of that absolutely for free. The second thing you can do that's really low cost is secure objects in your house that potentially could be, landing on you and hurting you when an earthquake happens. The bookshelf behind me is hooked to the wall so that it won't fall onto me as I sit at my desk if the earthquake were to happen. I can also use what's called quake putty or museum wax to hook down the objects so that those don't go flying around. If there's something you really care about, make sure it's not going to get broken if the earth is shaking. I don't hook down my regular dishes because I'm using them every day, and it'd be just way too much of a hassle, and I'd probably be happy to be able to replace my dishes. However, my grandmother's dishes are kept carefully wrapped up and brought out for Christmas and holidays, and I try to keep them in a low shelf in padding.
And I would suggest maybe not have things above your bed or near your bed, because a lot of these earthquakes happen while we're sleeping.
Right. Well, 1/3 of them are going to happen while you're sleeping because you spend 1/3 of your life in bed. And yes, I don't have any framed artwork. We don't have any glass-covered artwork in any of our bedrooms, actually, or in the hallway, because we want to make sure that we can get out without being hit by flying glass or having to walk over glass to get out of it. Oh, another really cheap one that I do. I have a pair of sneakers with a spare pair of glasses because I don't survive well without these, and an extra set of keys inside the sneakers and tied to my bed frame. So I don't have to walk through glass, and I know how to find a key when things are really messed up.
Wow, that's a great idea. What's the best thing a family can do to practice and prepare for an earthquake? You briefly mentioned that a moment ago. Communication, probably.
Well, yes, communication. Make sure you've decided how you're going to do it, and maybe even, depending on the age of the children, a bit of practicing about who you might call. The idea of having an out-of-state contact who can relay messages for you in case you're separated and you can't get through on phones to hear, locally. Another one that I did with my kids when they were younger is we played the earthquake game. And anybody could say earthquake, and we all had to pretend that an earthquake was happening and practice our drop, cover, hold on, going under a table. Right? I did, my kids discovered how much fun it was to make mommy jump under the table, and we had to put a limit on that. We couldn't play it more than once a month. But we then, did it in different rooms. What's the safe place in this room? And you practice going on, and you make a game out of it. My kids' daycare used to call it rabbits in the hole. Because the very littlest kids could think of that as a very fun thing to do. We'd be a rabbit going in a hole.
Okay, our next one. What needs to be in our earthquake kit? I'm going to throw out a suggestion. You go to ABC7.com. We have a list of earthquake preparedness, but what would you suggest in an earthquake kit?
Yeah, well, I would agree with you. Go to look at those lists, look at the things that matter. The most important things are not necessarily needing to be in a kit that can run out the door. That's sort of a hurricane idea. You're going to have a warning and you can evacuate. With an earthquake, it's no notice. You're probably staying in place. But it's make sure you have it. Top of the list is water. Second on the list is probably water as well. It's likely that we're going to be losing potable water into our houses for potentially weeks. And anything you could do to get through that period. I've talked with people in New Zealand who went through an earthquake, got through it, lost their water supply. And for the next month, they spend 2 hours a day standing in line to get water.
Wow.
To help them get their needs. And just, you don't want to do that if you don't have to. So anything you can do about storing water is potentially really, really important. The other one that I think is really good now, we are likely to be losing electricity and being able to charge your phone. So they've got these various phone chargers, basically a little solar panel with a USB port, maybe with a hand crank as well. And the fancy ones have a built-in AM radio. It allows you to communicate sort of no matter what the situation is. And knowledge always makes us feel better.
For sure.
And then there's plenty of other stuff, but go look at the lists on ABC7.
Well, we're going to throw up one question here because we're just shuttling through, but you've already answered it. How do we teach toddlers about earthquake safety? I thought your advice was wonderful, where you make a game out of it and you try to teach them what to do so they're not startled when it happens. But let's go to our next question here. How secure are our plumbing, water, power, and hospital shelters, the shelters in the LA area, in the event the big one hit? And you briefly talked about that as being a concern as well.
Oh, yeah, this is really the big issue. This is back to my concept that it's really about the community, not so much the individual, that we need to work together to be best prepared. You correctly identified the really big issues. It's power, it's water, it's sewer. That's one thing people never seem to think about. The water that comes in, there's water that got to go out too. And hospitals and transportation. One thing is that we, in any system, and our city is a type of system, it fails where it's already weak. Where do we already have trouble dealing in California? Fire, water, and healthcare. And those are indeed places that we expect to really have problems. So things are getting better in some places, especially Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, because of work of Mayor Garcetti when I was working with him a few years ago, has instituted a pretty major effort to upgrade the types of pipes in the ground so they are resistant to earthquake shaking. And a lot of the main ones are being addressed with that. We've got to make sure we keep focused and keep it happening. And I'd really like to see it expand to a lot more cities, because the vulnerability of our water pipes, I think, are our biggest problem. Power, again, LADWP hasn't done a lot extra recently on this. Edison has. They actually are going through a pretty major effort to really look at the seismic capacity of all of their substations and trying to be as resilient as they can. And they're heading in the right direction, I really think. Hospitals, again, we've had some pretty major upgrades that have happened, laws that were passed after we lost our hospitals. We do a great job of getting ready for the last earthquake. So because we had problems with hospitals in previous earthquakes, there's pretty strict regulations that are moving them towards being usable. I think it's really important. I just really hope we don't lose that focus. The pandemic is another stress on the hospitals that complicates things, but we are on track for getting a lot of our hospitals fixed up in that way. Shelters, I think a lot of people are going to try to avoid shelters in a pandemic. In general, we use schools for shelters, and that's actually a good thing. In California, we've had the Field Act in place since after the 1933 earthquake, requiring very stringent standards for our schools. And they are some of our safest buildings in California and the most likely to still be up and usable.
Okay. Do we currently have this is something that you spoke of a minute ago as well. Do we currently have a method of actively monitoring the San Andreas fault? And if so, how could that contribute to the potential for an early warning system? Back to the San Andreas, really.
Okay, well, it's also back to warning. So early warning, telling you that the earthquake's already underway, and you can use that information to, be safe on a matter of seconds. That's already in place. We use the existing earthquake monitoring system for California. It is our existing seismic stations that Caltech and USGS have been running here for decades, but we're now processing it much more quickly so we can use it for warning. This question seems to imply a different sort of warning, measuring something else that tells us the earthquake is going to happen before it begins. And that is, at this point, completely impossible. I think it is likely to remain impossible. As far as we can tell, and this is one of those places where science is still trying to find a different answer because we don't like it. But as far as we can tell, big earthquakes are completely random. Whether it happens today or tomorrow, that information maybe isn't even in the earth before the earthquake begins. Because, earthquakes happen every day, right? There'll be 50 or 100 in Southern California today, but almost all so small that we don't feel them. The difference between that and an earthquake that shakes down our houses is actually how large a part of the fault moves in the same earthquake. So earthquakes appear to all start the same way at a little tiny point. Most of them stop soon after that, and a very few grow larger to move down the fault, and then you get a magnitude, 4.5 because you've covered a football field size. And the very, very rare ones grow down for hundreds of miles and turns into the really big earthquake. What controls the size of the earthquake is therefore not how the earthquake begins, but how it ends. And as far as we can tell, that is determined dynamically during the earthquake. If that proves to be true, and notice I'll provide that if, earthquake prediction as people want it is absolutely impossible because the information just isn't even there until the big earthquake happens. We are still working at that. That's a fundamental earthquake physics problem that we're trying to do more work on. And, I'll be a scientist. We need more research. We need funding for that research because right now it looks impossible.
Well, I would compare it to Jenga. Anybody that's played Jenga, you can look at that game well in, and it should fall. It's going to fall, but you can't say when for sure it's going to fall until after it's already begun to fall. So there's my non-scientific version. Play Jenga and try to predict who's going to win,
Yeah, it's a pretty good conclusion because each earthquake that does happen changes the stress a little bit. And so that's sort of like each of those pieces that get removed along the way. And which one's the last one? It's very hard to tell.
What are the chances of California having a tsunami?
The chance of a tsunami in California is very rare. The good news is most of our faults are on land. And to have a tsunami, you need to change the shape of the seafloor. And the big ones happen because you've got a big, what's called a thrust fault underneath, let's see, we go like this, and one side moves up over the other. That displaces part of the seafloor. The water that used to be there has to go somewhere else, basically gets shoved up, falls back down, and moves off towards shore as a tsunami. Most of our faults are onshore, and most of our faults move sideways rather than up and down. So it's a very rare occurrence to have a tsunamigenic earthquake in California. We think there might have been one 200 years ago in the Santa Barbara Channel. There's our vertical faults there, and there are some reports, but it's pretty ambiguous. It's 1812. Not a lot of data. And since then, we really haven't had it. I'll give you one exception, which is you can trigger a landslide underwater. The strong shaking and earthquake triggers a lot of landslides. If it's close enough to the ocean that you trigger a landslide underwater, that also changes the shape of the seafloor. It can create a local tsunami. And we do have evidence that happened off of Long Beach about 8,000 years ago. So Long Beach had a very localized but big tsunami. But the big type of tsunami, like you see coming out of Japan or whatever, we just don't have the faults for that.
Okay, and our final question, and thank you so much for coming through with all of these answers. How effective is earthquake retrofit for buildings, and is it mandatory in California? You answered a little bit about that a moment ago, and I thought it was great when you talked about schools. It really is a different world here.
It is, but earthquake retrofit is not mandatory across the state. It is incredibly effective. I would love to see coming up with some system where we got more of it done. I will tell you that, so your earthquake, we have good earthquake codes, but your house is only as good as the earthquake code in place when it was built and the degree to which it's been enforced. Nobody requires you to retrofit your single family home. I will say every time I've bought a house, we moved a little bit. We've done it 4 times in California. every time we bring in a foundation specialist to tell us what we could do to make it safer. Once we didn't, it's cost zero when one case up to a maximum of $1,500. Not that I ever got one of the really bad houses. So it's incredibly important. When you look at commercial buildings, we are starting to see some mandatory retrofit, but it is by local jurisdiction. There is no state law about it. So about a dozen cities in Southern California, we're actually quite a bit ahead of Northern California in this, have passed retrofits for what are called soft first story buildings. Those are big apartment buildings where you've got parking on the first level, sort of like the Northridge Meadow apartments. A few of them have also taken on concrete buildings, which would be like the Northridge mall that collapsed in the '94 earthquake. Those type of dangerous buildings. But that's only in about 4 or 5 jurisdictions. Probably you don't live in that jurisdiction.
You know, you mentioned one thing, and I know it might cost a little bit of money to do, but correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of houses have clay pipes that takes us to sewage. And you might have that break just in general. I would think in an earthquake, your house could be fine, but you might end up losing your sewage line. It might be something to think about to change that, right?
Yeah, and it's one of the things is, since you don't know when the earthquake is, when you're doing some sort of work on your house anyway, why don't you get something done then? Think about adding it on. And actually, when we finally decided to replace some of our water pipes because of the galvanized pipe issue and corrosion, and once we dug it up, we replaced the sewer line at the same time for exactly that reason.
All right, Dr. Jones, thank you so much. I know we took up a lot of your time this afternoon, but thanks for bearing with us at the top as well. And so much information. I think let's remind everybody about Getting Through It podcast. It's a new podcast. You've done multiple episodes already. You take a lot less time in those to get a lot more information than you did today. So we thank you for taking so much time out of your day with us. So much information. I would think if there's a single message, plan ahead, because it is coming. As a community as well.
Science tells you what's inevitable, but also helps give you tools to manage it. The earthquake's inevitable, the disaster is not.
Thank you so much. That's Dr. Lucy Jones joining us here in the ABC7 studio. Thank you for your time. Hope we answered your question.
Hello, I'm Mark Brown. Click the ABC7 logo to subscribe to our Eyewitness News YouTube channel.